Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 2, Chapter 4. Orga. "Where is David?" Teddy said. Amanda did not know how to respond to the little bear. The toy boy was in the pig pen, where Mr. Johnson kept all the robots he broke in the show. He had a silly name, and he was a big, stupid man, and she didn't like it when Daddy had started working for him. But it pays the bills, as he always told her. Amanda didn't like all the things Daddy had to do to pay the bills. "I think they'll put him in the show," she said to the little bear, sadly. Then her face brightened up. "But you can stay with me now," she said. The little bear's neck made a whirring sound as it struggled in her grip. "I must see David," it said over and over. Amanda had never seen a toy act like this before. "You must take me to David, now," the toy demanded again in its gruff mechanical bark. At first the toy's insistence made her feel sad, but gradually it began to scare her. They had come from as far as Allentown, Trenton, and the partially submerged remains of Montclair to see the show, the Flesh Fair, the celebration of life. They knew about Trenton and the Orga man who had been split open and killed in the Mecha Masher. They'd forgiven the Johnson for that. It could not have been intentional, and the man had just been a drifter after all, one who did not earn his lot. That kind made life as difficult as the Mecha did. Some had come because they believed the Johnson was the spokesperson for their kind, the champion of the lost and forgotten Orga who held society together at its roots, those that the ungrateful and selfish wealthy had not found a way to replace yet. Others were here because there wasn't much left for them in this ruined world but hard toil, hard drink, and a few mecha to screw up over the weekend. They were of all colors and faiths, nor did age determine this demographic. Among them were those who had been replaced by mechanical workers, and even those who had benefited from the cheap labor of man-made slaves. No criterion, save for that of anger and resentment, often justifiable, could be used to define them. All of them wanted a show, and what a show the good Lord Johnson was giving them tonight. The band had been better than usual. Cynthia, that beautiful blonde pride of the Orga, had paraded about, waving their banner, and made speech after speech, working the faithful and the fun-loving alike into a frenzy. And while it seemed that there were fewer mecha than usual, each one's disposal was treated like a small celebration of its own. And now, to top off the evening, the man himself made an entrance. It was the Johnson. The crowd stood and applauded. They cupped their eyes to see into the shadows behind the bag toss display. It looked like he had a new prize for them. 2 of them, actually. They couldn't see clearly, but one of them looked like a new model, one of them lover bots. Well, this ought to be a riot. The crowd broke into an excited roar. Scantily clad assistants tossed little beanbags to the crowd. Their arms reached out like the necks of ravenous nestlings, craning for their mother's regurgitated nourishments. "Up here, honey," Stewart called. He had led Amanda from the control room and was lifting her little frame onto a platform near the stage. In the arena below, Johnson was preparing to address the crowd. Stewart had considered just taking the amazing little mecha, but he was outmanned. He'd thought then about enlisting the aid of some of his crew, but they had wives and children and homes to attend to. They'd never challenged Johnson. He even considered paying one of the audience members to claim it belonged to them. Being property would surely protect this unique device. But he finally realized that it was all just fantasy. One of the most ingenious pieces of work he had ever seen was about to be destroyed for a raucous crowd of drunks and unfortunates who would never even appreciate the genius of its design. But what had Stewart wanted from the boy machine anyway? He had been a programmer years ago. He fell in love with designing personality parameters, defining the intellectual and logical limits that were necessary to make a machine act real. And that's why he had immediately recognized the difference in the boy. Even in their brief conversation, he had seen the way its logic functioned differently from other machines. But Stewart had never felt any attachment to Mecha. He was angry and hurt, but he didn't know why. Wasn't there something about this one? He would swear there was something. When he was looking at it, into its innocent gaze, he'd swear that something was looking back. He shrugged that thought away. It was silly and impossible. Then he saw the teddy in Amanda's arms. It was still protesting. It wouldn't shut up about the David thing. How had such a bond developed between them? Where had these things come from? "Amanda, let me talk to the teddy for a minute, okay, honey?" he said, reaching for the bear. The little girl reluctantly let her father take the struggling toy. "You must take me to David now," it was repeating over and over. Stewart knew these old models. If it functioned as a smart toy regulator, then it should know manufacturers and possibly models. "Who is David's maker?" Stewart said to the super toy. The teddy ceased its complaints suddenly. It looked up at Stewart while it processed this question. Then its face folded into a grimace of impatience. "Monica is David's mommy," it replied. David was dropped rudely by the angry man with the big black hat. He fell into the dirt and closed his eyes to protect them from the dust raised by his fall. When he opened them, he noticed that the money had fallen out of the pocket of his jacket. The last thing that Mommy had to offer him was laying in the dirt. He moved quickly to retrieve his new bucks, but another man, even bigger and stronger than the first, lifted him quickly and placed him in the spotlights on the big metal stand. The pit bulls thrust the Loverbot into the platform with the little one, a double feature. The two lifelike simulants were then bound to the display with chains, the little one shackled up front of the larger, while the Orga in the darkness beyond the blinding spotlights cheered and whooped. But not all of the crowd continued cheering. Some of them had been silenced by the sight of the small boy-like thing that had been hoisted into the lights of the acid bath. Lord Johnson Johnson stepped before the crowd and waved an arm to silence them. They were excited, his followers, so it took a minute for them to settle down. He could not see beyond the spotlights that bathed the arena in a fluorescent glow, but he knew who they were in the dark beyond those lights. They were the forgotten ones, the pushed out and the angry. They had a right to be angry, and they were about to get angrier. He was going to make sure of that. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages," he began. He turned and gestured to the mecha that were chained to the boards. "What'll they think of next?" he said, as the crowd viewed the simulants. He let them study the two for a silent moment. "See here," he said, pointing at David. "A boy bot, a tinker toy, a living doll." He fell quiet for a moment, while the crowd absorbed the sight of the little mecha. He heard some gasping and a few "oh my gods" from beyond the lights. It must be the Trenton thing again. Damn it. He knew there was going to be some squawkers among them, but didn't know how many. They might take to the little mecha at first. He'd seen for himself how well it simulated emotions, but he'd show them the kind of commitment it would take to save themselves from the scourge of artificiality. He threw off his hat in a dramatic gesture. "We all know why they made them," he shouted. "To steal your hearts, to replace your own children." He began to pace the arena. He was going to capture them, bring them into his anger, and make it theirs, because that's where it belonged, in them. "This is the latest generation in a series of insults to human dignity," he yelled. "The next step in their grand scheme to phase out all God's little children, to make us obsolete." He had them now. He could hear their breath. He could feel their pulse racing, as was his. Their hatred was his electricity, the power which drove his machinery. He stopped finally, his pace perfectly timed to bring him back to the display. Meet the next generation of child, designed to do just that. The Orga in the bleachers saw it, observed it carefully. What was this? A little boy? They knew that the derelicts hid in the outskirts with the runaway mecha. What if they had grabbed one of the vagabond kids by accident? That ain't no mecha, someone whispered. Remember Trenton, said someone else. There was confusion, indecision about this. David gazed into the darkness beyond the lights. The crowd was silent now, just some soft muttering is all he could hear. The fear inside him had reached a new level. He, like no other robot before him, anticipated his demise. In the darkness beyond the lights lay the source of an inexplicable hatred that David had never seen and did not understand, a hatred that no mecha would ever comprehend. Humanity itself had yet to answer the question, from whence does this hatred come? Above David, a man was pouring acid into the buckets, acid that would reduce him into fibrous clumps, that would take away from the world a truly unique creation, and take from David something that no mecha before him had ever known. Lord Johnson Johnson, self-appointed savior of mankind, recognized the tenderness and the hesitancy of his disciples, but he knew what insidious plot lay at the heart of this ingenious simulator. He fixed them all with the uncompromising glare that had burned a path through whatever obstacles had stood in his way since Dublin. Do not be fooled by the artistry of this creation, he warned them. No doubt there was talent, genuine human talent, in the crafting of this simulator. Yet with the very first strike, you will see the big lie come apart. Something struck the arm of David's jacket. A drop had slipped prematurely from the bucket above him, just a tiny bit of the toxic fluid they would use to take his life. David heard something hissing and looked at the arm of his coat where it had landed. It was burning. Why was it burning? He looked up and saw the man filling the buckets. The image of the nanny's melting face alerted through his brain. This was the place where they destroyed. Don't burn me! Don't burn me! Don't burn me! He cried. I'm not Pinocchio! Don't make me die! I'm David! I'm David! A startled woman stood up from the crowd. What the hell was that? Was that a child? The small helpless thing was crying and screaming like an Orga. Mecha don't plead for their lives, she yelled. Some people stood and grunted acknowledgement around her. Whose child is that? Another screamed. He looks like a boy, yelled another. I'm David! I have a mommy! David yelled, his face twisted in fear and desperation. Johnson realized how well this thing was constructed. Clever the way it tried to steal their hearts. But he would show them how to do it. It's built like a boy to disarm us, he countered. See how they imitate our emotions now? He thought he had them again. They were silent, spellbound. Behind him, the mecha boy cried and sputtered fearful gibberish like a living thing. But they would see. They would see. Remember, no matter what performance this sim puts on, we are only demolishing artificiality. There was not a sound to be heard, except for the whimpering of the phony boy thing. Johnson picked up a bag from the ground and held it high. The destruction of this machine would be a symbol of their commitment to a world of, by, and for Orga, their commitment to life and to all living things, their commitment to him. Let he who is without sim cast the first stone, he said, and stepped away from the killing zone. There was silence. No one moved. Johnson could not see beyond the lights, could not read their faces, so he waited. Eventually, one of them stood and took aim. He was a simple man. He came to the flesh fair because he knew the frustration of the modern age and what it had done to Orga kind. He was a farmer. Like Johnson had done so long ago, He'd built his farm with his bare hands. He couldn't afford the Mecca. Every year it was a struggle to keep up with the big Mecca-based businesses, which were stealing more and more of the limited local markets in their greedy pursuit of everything. Even those who hated the robots bought from the big corporate chains now. The prices were just too good. He'd been at the Flesh Fair in Trenton when that man had died. In the ensuing months, he'd seen the reprisals and the attacks on the Johnson. He'd felt bad about it because he always believed that the Johnson was a good man. Tonight, he'd watched them big old pit bulls lead the scared-looking machine from the cage and onto the acid bath. He'd watched them chain the little fake thing onto the wheel. All the while Johnson had been explaining to them how dangerous this thing was. He'd been listening. He'd been listening when the thing started crying, too. When Johnson had called for them to strike at the pathetic simulator, he'd stood up from the crowd and taken careful aim. He'd always believed that Johnson was a good man and that he had a point. But this man had a point, too. A point he would not go beyond. He let the beanbag fly. The first bag hit Johnson square in the forehead, and it hurt. He'd moved his arm to deflect the strike, but too late. Damn idiot farmers, he thought. Whoa there, is what he said into the mic, though. He smiled up at the stands to show he understood that it was a mistake. That was when the second bag hit him. This one caught his nose and caused him to see stars. Bright pain flared in his head. Then another hit him just below the waist, causing him to buckle. Then another, and soon he was being pelted from all directions of the arena. They roared at him, "Johnson, you're a monster!" And, "He's just a boy!" And, "What's enough, Johnson? What's enough?" They wanted to know. What in the hell was wrong with them, Johnson wondered. He shouted at them, "It's a machine, you idiots! A damn toy!" But his voice was lost in the rage of disapproval and incredulity from those he'd imagined to be his loyal and trusting disciples. Never had the Johnsons so severely misread an audience's silence. They'd been incredulous that he would destroy something so helpless, so fragile. So what if it was Mecca? Even from the stands they could plainly see it wasn't like the others. It wasn't trying to steal their jobs, take their money. It wasn't out to exploit their wives' or husbands' weaknesses. It was just a little boy. Somebody had wanted love, and the Johnson had been too blind to see it, too selfish to care. They stormed from the stands and onto the arena floor. Cynthia had started walking away from the arena the moment she'd seen the first bag hit Johnson. She'd had an uneasy feeling about the crowd's silence as the stupid pit bulls led the little boy Mecca into the field. Johnson was such a pompous fool. He really thought he could go as far as he wanted. As the audience stormed into the arena, she turned and hurried away. She started running the minute she hit the shadows behind the bleachers. As she made her way to the dressing rooms to get her stuff, she passed by the band, who were already packing their gear. "Need a ride, baby?" the singer said. His eyes were appraising her. Without that silly metal mask, he wasn't really that bad. "Let me get my stuff," she yelled, racing to her dressing room. There was always another gig, somewhere. Stuart had heard all about Mommy's flight and their trip through the forest. He was amazed when he heard about the Blue Fairy and David's quest. Teddy had explained in short, precise sentences as Johnson had been ranting in the arena. Stuart had been prepared for one of the most dismal nights of his life. He was ready to watch that poor, beautiful piece of machinery destroyed by a lunatic. Then he blinked in amazement as the crowd suddenly began pelting Johnson with the beanbags. His heart jumped. "Yes!" he yelled. He grabbed Amanda. "Honey, you say goodbye to Teddy," he said. His daughter looked up sadly, but she understood. She was happy that the boy toy wasn't going to be burnt up like the others, and she knew that Teddy was his friend. But she hated to see them go. "Goodbye, Teddy," she said, her little voice breaking and the tears starting to flow. "Goodbye, Amanda," Teddy responded. Stuart kissed his daughter, then he took the bear and raced into the field. He had to get there before some idiot accidentally knocked over the acid and ruined one of the best creations he'd ever had the privilege of meeting. 30 minutes ago, he would have been more worried about the resulting lawsuits against Johnson if someone should get hurt in the fray. But the hell with the bastard now. This was probably the end of the flesh fair and the end of his job. He'd be on the hunt for work again, with all the other struggling sysops. But he hadn't felt this good in a long time. David did not understand what was happening. His sense of alarm had diminished when he saw the multitude from beyond the lights race onto the field and begin knocking things over. They roared and threw things at the big men in black, who retreated quickly under the imposing onslaught. Had he misunderstood them? This was not the same as the destroying he had witnessed earlier. He pressed himself tighter against the man mecha behind him. Joe had finally understood what was about to happen. In his own way, he knew his troubles would be over soon enough. His only regret was that he'd had no time to shut off his sensory system. But Joe had not understood the organ-like noises and pleading the little one made. He had listened in perplexed silence at the display. He was glad, however, to see the effect the crying game had on the crowd. They were not going to be scrapped tonight. Then he saw the organ man trying to untie them. "Help me get him out of here, you oafs!" Stuart yelled at the pit bulls as he struggled with the chains. The huge men in black were dumbfounded at the response of the crowd. Some of them had fled. Others had rushed Johnson off to safety as the riot began. But otherwise they'd had no appropriate response to the situation. "Let's get him out of here now, before they tear this place apart!" Stuart yelled. Finally the men saw his point, and they began yanking the chains loose. One of them took down the buckets of acid so no one would get burnt. The two mecha were quickly set free, and Stuart set the teddy on the ground next to the special machine. He took one last look at the boy. He wished he had more time to study it, time to understand what made it different from anything he'd ever seen. But he figured that the machine, that David, had his own mission, his own dream. Amazing. "Get out of here! Run!" Stuart yelled at David and his friends. The odd trio looked around in confusion for a moment, and then fled towards the gates, away from the crowd of rampaging Orga. They left behind the wreckage of those who had not been designed suitably to elicit sympathy. The destruction of the older decrepit machines was another pitiful chapter in an ancient Orga farce. But they were alive. Of the three, David was the only one capable of mourning the fallen mecha. But David had other things on his mind. They ran past the gates and into the dark night. The forest was a welcome sight, offering shadows in which to hide. Behind them the sounds of fighting and confusion rose and spiraled to a crescendo. The robots ran, leaving the flesh fair behind them, leaving behind another fallen Orga hero to face his fate.